Welcome to the final installment of the Discover with Nature virtual travel series that will explore the lands and waters of Louisiana today. You will also learn a little bit about what goes on throughout the Southern Division in some of our large-scale landscape, watershed, and seascape programs, including longleaf pine, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Mississippi River Basin programs. Just a personal note, this is the beginning of crawfish season. And while virtual touring can offer a sense of place, nothing beats enjoying a crawfish boil in person. And we'll be glad to greet everyone warmly over a Cajun meal when we can all safely move about again. Enjoy the tour of this special place.
Thank you very much, Michael. Welcome everyone to Louisiana. My name is Seth Blitch. I'm our Coastal Program Director here in Louisiana. And with me outside today is Karen Gautreaux, our Government Relations Director, Taylor Barnett, our Communications Fellow, and Dr. Brian Piazza, our Director of Freshwater Marine Science. We are going to have a tour today of a lot of the conservation work that we do on the ground here. We're going to do it through the lens of connectivity. So you hear a lot about individual projects, but also how they relate to one another, and then also how those projects are nested in some of the whole system work that we do within the division that Michael mentioned, and even beyond. Much as rainfall will come and fall on a upland area, and then run into a river, and then run ultimately to the Gulf. That's kind of how we think about our work. And again, that's how we'll describe it to you today. So you should have a map up. We are, as you can see, or could have seen when we were on screen, we are in the Atchafalaya River Basin. We are sitting about 45 minutes to the south and west of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It's a great day here. We've got birds calling, the migration is on. We've had northern parulers call. Just a few minutes ago, we had a pair of red-tailed hawks actually mating just off to our screen. And you can't see it, but there's a little sycamore right next to me that's got a little lizard in it, actually watching the presentation right now. So we've got a really varied audience. And on the map, you'll see, or have seen, there's a map of the basin, and it shows there's some dark red dots, and that's about 5,400 acres in the basin that TNC owns, and is part of our Atchafalaya Basin Preserve. You're going to hear more about the basin here shortly. I'm going to lead off by talking a little bit about our work in longleaf pine. This is our uplands work, and we do a lot of work in longleaf pine communities and habitats. It was a habitat that has spanned still from Virginia all the way to Texas. Historically, it covered nearly 90 million acres in the southern United States. Today, there is less than 5% of that left. And so it is an important habitat. It supports a lot of biodiversity. Obviously, longleaf pine was very important in the commercial timber market. But today, we're going to talk about some of the work that we do in Louisiana with longleaf pine on our Abita Creek Preserve. I mentioned diversity. I think you can see from the slide on the leftmost image, really mature stands of longleaf. The trees are actually spaced, fairly well apart, so lots of light actually gets to the ground, and that lets all kinds of plants occur there, and that supports a lot of different animal life. So a lot of that biodiversity happens when the system is healthy. And the way that we ensure that longleaf pine systems are healthy is through the use of fire, specifically prescribed fire, which is when we actually set the woods on fire on purpose. Fires historically happened throughout the US, and they're responsible for actually maintaining the health of a lot of communities. And that's true for longleaf pine. It helps keep out species like oaks and other species of trees that would otherwise grow up and shade other trees out and outcompete longleaf. And so we have our preserves throughout the division that we will burn that have longleaf on a regular basis, as well as actually planting trees themselves. And both of those things help to really restore the habitat. Included in that diversity is also that rich biodiversity are some endangered plants and animals too, and those are really important in these habitats. The bird you see is a red-cockaded woodpecker. A lot of you in the South have probably heard of red-cockaded woodpeckers. They nest in mature longleaf pines that have hardwood rot, and they seek out those trees and they excavate cavities in there, and that's where they live and they raise young. Again, they have to have an open understory, or not a lot of vegetation on the ground to do well and to survive. And so again, that stresses the importance of fire. And then the kind of unattractive, nondescript plant that you see there is called chaff seed, but it's also heavily endangered. In fact, in Louisiana, the only place that chaff seed occurs is on our Avita Creek Preserve. And so it underscores, and it's maintained through the use of regular burning and the other stewardship measures that we employ on our preserve. So it again underscores the use of fire and the on the ground stewardship that we use. And as Michael mentioned, longleaf pine is one of the whole systems that's very important in the Nature Conservancy. Nearly all of the chapters throughout the division have some kind of longleaf program and participate in some kind of restoration and conservation of these habitats. Our fire crews work closely with the fire crews in Mississippi and even share among all the fire crews throughout the division, which is pretty common. And then longleaf pine habitat is also really important because it's good for water quality. Again, healthy habitat, when it rains on it, drains to the soil and becomes part of the groundwater, or runs off and becomes part of surface water. And having those habitats and those ecosystems really intact really helps to improve groundwater as it moves through the landscape. And to tell you more about water, here's Dr. Brian Piazza.
Thank you, Seth. Our state is connected to 2/3 of the US and 2 Canadian provinces by the water that's flowing by us right now. For example, in the Atchafalaya River Basin, where we are today, receives its water from the Mississippi and Red Rivers, meaning that this water comes from as far away as Great Falls, Montana, to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We experience their big rains days after they occur. We feel their droughts, and we receive their snow melt after their winter weather ends. But we don't receive just the water. We receive everything that's in the water, good and bad. And these swampy woods also provide bird habitat that connect us to faraway lands like the Arctic to Argentina, and also contain species of fish that connect us to the time of the dinosaurs. But across space and time, these river systems that have connected us have been dramatically modified. Forests have been converted into agricultural fields and urban centers, affecting the way the water runs off the land. Water rushes into rivers where it's channeled between levees or stored behind dams, all of it managed for navigation and flood control. Climate change is causing more intense severe rain events and changing the patterns of flows, stacking more water between those levees, and creating situations where flooding becomes more prevalent. And because all these realities come together in Louisiana, we must work outside our borders to ensure that places like the Atchafalaya River Basin remain healthy. And conversely, by working and protecting key areas within our state, we contribute to making the entire Mississippi River Basin and the Gulf of Mexico healthier. So our staff is part of a larger network of TNC conservationists that are working upstream to implement science-driven solutions to manage water, reduce nutrients, and restore habitat. Likewise, we're working in the lower river to restore floodplain wetlands and the Louisiana Delta, where the Gulf of Mexico begins. Now, floodplains are unique wetlands where the fluctuation of the river and the periodic inundation of these wetlands creates a very dynamic connection between the aquatic world of the river and the terrestrial world of the surrounding landscape. And that unique connection creates a bunch of different habitats. And so these are areas of very high biodiversity. So this river basin, for example, has over 300 species of fish and wildlife. Likewise, floodplains clean the water. They remove sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and other harmful chemicals from the surface water. And finally, floodplains store carbon in their soils and in the plants and trees, helping to mitigate climate change and absorb water and release it slowly to help with flooding. So Louisiana has a lot of big floodplains to restore. And today I'm going to show you two of our biggest floodplain restoration projects that not only benefited Louisiana, but the entire Mississippi River Basin and the Gulf of Mexico. So first, about 300 miles north of here along the Ouachita River, TNC worked with partners to reconnect and restore 16,000 acres of floodplains that were fed by periodic inundation of the Ouachita River. This was turned to farmland. So Mollisey Farms is on the left side of your screen. This was once part of a huge native complex of floodplains that were fed by that Ouachita River, which is in the middle of your screen. In the 1960s, that area was deforested and converted to agricultural fields. They basically bulldozed all the trees, piled them up, and lit them on fire. Likewise, they separated the Ouachita River from Mollisey with a 16-mile long, 30-foot high levee. And finally, the bayous that ran through Mollisey were plugged and severed and replaced with a system of drainage canals. From 1990 to 2013, TNC worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to acquire Mollisey Farms and add it to the Upper Ouachita National Wildlife Refuge, plant over 3 million trees, remove portions of that levee to restore the connection of the Ouachita River to Mollisey, and finally, we reconstructed the historic bayous and plugged those drainage canals. So all this work not only restored the Mollisey floodplain, but also restored drainage to upstream watersheds, increasing our project footprint from 16,000 acres to over 75,000 acres. Today, Mollisey is providing excellent fish and wildlife habitat. It's removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. We've witnessed Mollisey actually switch from an agricultural field that exported fertilizer runoff to a floodplain that's now removing fertilizer runoff from upstream. And finally, we also witnessed Mollisey reduce flood stage on the Ouachita River during a record flood in 2009 by almost a foot, which in lowland areas like Louisiana is a really, really big deal. So finally, I'm going to talk about the Atchafalaya Basin, where we are today. This is the largest intact floodplain left in the Mississippi River Basin. It's 1 million acres of continuous wetland habitat, which is really huge for this part of the country. Now, these wetlands provide all of those key benefits I talked about earlier, but a couple interesting facts about the Atchafalaya. First, this was ground zero for saving the Louisiana black bear when it was on the verge of extinction, and this basin remains critical to its recovery. Second, this is a basin where people still really legitimately live off the land. Perhaps you've heard of or seen one of the many reality television shows about alligator hunting or swamp living. Those people and their way of life is real, and it's supported by these wetlands. The Atchafalaya River is also the principal distributary of the lower Mississippi River Basin. And so we receive about 30% of the flow daily of the Mississippi River through the old river control structure. This basin is completely surrounded by levees and managed as a system of floodways. So while the Atchafalaya has these vast uninterrupted wetlands, it's an extremely highly engineered system. Its waters are intensively managed and its flows have been altered. This engineering has broken the plumbing system in the Atchafalaya and interrupted that natural drainage and flooding pattern that we see in wetlands. And this has affected the basin's ability to preserve good water quality. What happens is we end up with huge stagnant water masses that create low oxygen dead zones that diminish the forest health and create huge fish kills during the summer months. So we've made the choice to improve the basin. And to do this, we've created the Atchafalaya River Basin Initiative. This is TNC's long-term vision to protect and restore this great American swamp forest. Our goal is to ensure that people and wildlife can enjoy the basin for centuries to come. The initiative was founded on three foundational components: restoration, science, and community. We launched the initiative in 2015 with the purchase of the Atchafalaya Basin Preserve, 5,300 acres that serve as the anchor and a platform for our work here in the basin. We're doing things like working with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to figure out ways to manage the system-wide flow inputs for nature when flood control is not needed. We're also working with the state to cut notches and gaps in high canal banks that span across our preserve, impounding water and creating these dead zones. We want to restore that natural flooding and drainage pattern, and we think it's going to benefit not only water quality, but fish and wildlife habitat, nutrient sequestration, and carbon mitigation. We hope that this is going to work. We think it's going to work about 9,000 acres improvement, and we hope to expand this to 100,000 acres. We're testing our hypotheses with a comprehensive monitoring program measuring water flow and water quality. We also developed a conservation fellows program where we're working with students across multiple universities to measure the impacts of our restoration and also to communicate those results. You're going to hear from Taylor soon. And finally, we've engaged the local community in our restoration. Community is what this floating research station is all about. Getting people together out on the land to learn together and work together to create a new culture of restoration in the Atchafalaya. Thank you. I'm now going to turn it over to Karen, who's going to tell you about the partnerships necessary to do this kind of work.
Great, thank you, Brian. Again, I'm Karen Gotro, the Director of Government Relations for the Nature Conservancy in Louisiana. And today what I would like to share with you is some information on how policy helps support conservation in the water and on the ground in Louisiana. And partnerships are incredibly important. We work with federal, state, and local government partners. We work with community members, and we work with other local or other environmental organizations that want to also do this conservation work. The first thing I'd like to tell you about is something that Brian referenced. We're looking at through the Sustainable Rivers Partnership with the Corps of Engineers and the Atchafalaya River project. And the Sustainable Rivers Partnership is a nationwide partnership between the Corps and the Nature Conservancy to look at the potential of altering flows for ecosystem benefits, altering those flows through core structures. And while we want to look at those benefits, the structures are also, excuse me, buzzing there. The structures have to be operated for the purposes for which they were constructed. So in the Atchafalaya Sustainable Rivers Partnership, we're asking the question, can the operation of the control structure be managed for flood control, flood risk reduction, and navigation as it was designed for while achieving some ecosystem benefits? So we enrolled with the Corps, the Atchafalaya River in the SRP program in 2019. And in Louisiana, two of our partners are the state of Louisiana through the governor's office and the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. We work with the Corps and the state to propose tasks for funding, and all of this funding flows through the Corps budget. So our goal is to implement and monitor an experimental flow that tests a management question in the first 3 years. So some of these, one of the parameters is that we're working within the 70-30 congressionally mandated split of the flows of the combined Mississippi and Red to the Atchafalaya, 30%. And we're also asking the question, are there other structures within this basin that could impact flows? For example, in the basin upriver of the old river control structure, there are a series of locks and dams on the Red River. So those might be an alternative too. So we've outlined an SRP process for scientific and stakeholder partnership and planning. And we know that we have experienced record flood and inundation on the Mississippi River. And so we are going to need to be looking at managing that. And can the things that we find out through this process be applied ultimately to some lower Mississippi River management? As an example, with the precipitation and long periods of high levels of river stages, the Corps has been in a phase 1, in 2019 was in a phase 1 flood fight for 269 days, which is a record. So we can tell conditions are changing on this river. So Speaking of the Atchafalaya, in February of last year, Governor John Bell Edwards announced an initiative related to the importance of the Atchafalaya and its integration in the restoration of the coast, particularly into the Coastal Master Plan, which I'll address in a little while. We're participants in the newly created Atchafalaya Basin Restoration and Enhancement Task Force, which is charged with making recommendations to benefit this complex system, which is a conservation priority for us, obviously. And although the Atchafalaya Basin is certainly facing challenges, the coast of Louisiana is in a crisis. The Atchafalaya is one of the few areas that is actually building land. We've lost 1,900 square miles of our coast and projected to lose 2,250 more in the next 50 years if we don't do anything. So the state of Louisiana has developed a coastal master plan for a sustainable coast, and we are one of the participants in developing policy and providing science input into that plan. This plan is a $50 billion suite of projects to be done over 50 years, and our recommendations focus on nature-based solutions, working with nature to have ecosystem benefits, as well as those being natural climate solutions. Many of these projects have the ability to adapt to the impacts of climate in the future, including sea level rise. And Seth is going to give an example of another part of our work with the Coastal Master Plan and a nature-based solution. So although we wouldn't have asked for the opportunity, many of the important projects that have been designed in the master plan are being funded through Deepwater Horizon restoration dollars. One example of a nature-based solution is the mid-dip Barataria sediment diversion. And it is designed to divert high levels of sediments into the Barataria Basin that's experienced incredible land loss, I think 476,000 acres over time, to restore that freshwater and sediment inflow to replace the estuarine functions in this basin. And this will essentially be accomplished by implementing a diversion project that connects the Mississippi River to the basin to restore those natural estuarine flows. And as mentioned earlier, it's not just the ecosystem that benefits, it's there's communities and industries that depend on a healthy coast. And it's important to note that we will never restore the coast to its historic configurations, but we do want to try to make it continue to be a functioning coast as long as possible. And we think there's good science and efforts in that regard. So the last thing I want to mention is just reinforcing that idea that we work with partners in order to get our work done. I like this particular slide because it shows partners from all the sectors that I mentioned, the federal level, state, local, community, and NGO partners. So with that, I hope you'll get down to visit us in the Atchafalaya and get to see where we partner in our conservation center throughout the basin. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Karen. And as Karen mentioned, we're going to talk about the coast. And so all of this water that you see flowing by us now is making its way down to the Gulf of Mexico and all the sediment that it's carrying. So as she mentioned, the only two places in Louisiana that are building land along the coast are at the mouth of the Atchafalaya River and the Wax Lake outlet, which is also an outlet for the river. So just to kind of impress upon you the challenges that the coasts face, I wanted to share this image with you. You can see on the image on the left, this is the Grand Isle area. Grand Isle is the only inhabited barrier island in Louisiana. We actually have, the Nature Conservancy has a preserve there that's really important for migratory songbirds. So like right now, we've got thousands of birds that are landing on Grand Isle. It's the first land they've seen since they crossed the Gulf, since they left the tropics. But you can see that, you know, the image on the left is from 1932, and then the image on the right is from 2011. That's pretty profound loss of land, and that's emblematic of what goes on in Louisiana and what we're up against. And so the work that both Karen and Brian described, I think really reinforced that sometimes a lot of the things that you can do for the coast, some of the best things that you can do for the coast aren't actually on the coast. It's really ensuring that fresh water, which maintains coastal plant communities, and sediment, which builds land when the land is eroded, are really important. And a lot of that conservation work and those partnerships actually happen, you know, far away from the coast, sometimes way up into the Mississippi River Basin. And so that really matters. And so and the reason for this land loss is pretty varied. It's again, it's primarily depend on the absence of freshwater and sediment, because when we levied all these rivers off, like especially the Mississippi, that whole sediment load is actually lost offshore now, and all that fresh water that used to nourish the marshes is also gone. And so again, that's what we're working towards. And but there are other reasons too. I mean, there's energy exploration and transportation projects have actually created canals that have brought higher salinity water up into marshes, and that fairly rapid change in salinity has actually endangered plant communities which have been lost. And then subsequently, the land on which those plants sit is also lost. And so those are all things that have acted in concert to really make the land loss and ultimately the coastal resource management and conservation in Louisiana a challenge. But there's always going to be a coast. It's not an insurmountable challenge. One of the areas that we're active is that loss of shell fisheries, specifically oysters, again through a number of different reasons, has impacted the coast a lot. Reefs are natural breakwaters as a habitat, and they support all kinds of critters as well. There's shrimp and crabs and fish that spend all or part of their life cycle on oyster reefs. They either find forage there so that they can escape predation, or they find refuge to escape predation, or they can forage on things that grow among oysters, as well as the oysters themselves. Globally, oysters have been lost 85% probably. And here in the Gulf of Mexico, we've lost them. It's one of the best places still left on the planet. We've still lost oysters anywhere from 50 to 85%. And just in the last 5 years, really once really rich bays like Apalachicola Bay have completely lost their oyster resources, again, for myriad reasons. Some of it has to do with fishing. A lot of it has to do with fresh water supply and human caused changes in that. And some of that is what we see here in Louisiana. But we've installed 6 miles of reef in the last 10 years, which is great, in different locations throughout the state. And we put in, usually we use different materials. In this image on the left, you can see that we're right next to the shoreline, and we're using a crane to lower a unit in. It's about 6 foot by 6 foot by 1 foot tall. It is a cage full of rocks. But what we don't have in the system anymore is we don't have a lot of oysters. And oysters is the substrate upon which other oysters grow. And so we're putting that substrate out there, and there's still plenty of larval or baby oysters floating around from the natural reefs that are left. And those baby oysters will attach to this substrate. They'll grow and then reproduce. They don't move anymore once they've settled, but that ultimately gives you a living reef. And the image on the right shows you that just after probably not even quite 3 years, we have these oysters. And kind of like the chaff seed I showed you earlier, they're not the most photogenic wildlife to look at, but they're heavily important for the health of the coast. And you can see that we have, what was just sort of an inert pile of rocks in a cage is a living, breathing reef that supports all kinds of life, protects the shoreline. Oysters feed by filtering water. And so they actually help to maintain and improve water quality. And so it's very important that way too. But oysters also really impinge, I think, heavily on the coastal identity of a lot of places, the cultural identity of a lot of coastal communities. And so oysters are not just a habitat or a fishery. It's not an either or situation. They're both. And oysters are managed exclusively as a commodity, though, throughout the Gulf of Mexico. And so, again, it has been incumbent on us to engage better with the fishery community. One of the things we've done in Calcasieu Lake, where you saw the oyster project in the previous slide, is we actually started the Oyster Resource Group. And that's state, federal, local partners like a Port Authority, plus people from the fishing industry. And we've been able to have conversations. We actually created a charter of collaboration around the things that we really had in common and agreed with around oysters, which was most things, unsurprisingly. And so we've been able to, as a group of very broad stakeholders, really talk about what our shared goals are. And through projects like the one that I showed you earlier and other projects that we have, really bring back oysters as both a habitat and a fishery or an economic resource to that area. I could talk about it all day, and I'll spare you for sure. So that's a very quick introduction to some of the oyster work we do. As Karen mentioned, it's a terrific nature-based solution. So now we've heard from Karen, Brian, and I, and collectively we probably have 90 years of experience in conservation and natural resource management, which is a lot. But Taylor is going to talk to you a little bit. Taylor is just starting her career. In fact, when she leaves here, she's going to class at LSU. But Taylor represents the future of conservation. And so she's going to give you a few thoughts, I think, on her time, with TNC and thinking about her future. And we're certainly happy to have her as part of the team. And so with that, here's Taylor. Thank you.
All right, so as Seth mentioned, I'm Taylor. I am the Communication Fellow for the Louisiana chapter of TNC. And so for me entering this field, I think conservation is one of those areas of expertise that can feel very inaccessible, just as far as understanding what's happening for people new to the field or who don't have that background. And I'm one of those people. So when I came into this role, I was very worried that just because I didn't have that knowledge that I wouldn't necessarily be effective in my role. But as I'm closing out my first year with TNC, I've learned that, yes, don't get me wrong, there is a learning curve. There's a lot that I don't know and a lot that I have to learn, and I'm sure that won't change. But there were also skills that I already had that I used right off the bat to start contributing to the work that's already being done. And for me, obviously I'm communication. So some of those skills are, the ability to tell stories and the ability to translate, information into content or a format that's digestible and relatable to the everyday person. And obviously this is super important with conservation because, like I said, the information and the concepts and terminology can be tricky to understand, and the language is obviously very science heavy and not something that an everyday person might find engaging necessarily. So storytelling and translating that information has been a big part of what I do. And my main goal has been trying to communicate TNC's projects and conservation overall, the benefits to, policymakers, community leaders, and Louisiana residents overall. And so as we've heard today, conservation goes a long way to protecting shorelines, forests, and other habitats that, support various species. But there's also a human benefit to it. And it's very important for me to communicate that, especially when trying to gain support and rally and just kind of create that understanding amongst, everyday citizens. So conservation also, as we've heard today, provides extra protection against flooding. It also provides clean drinking water. And it also has a tremendous impact on, the local and state economy, through outdoor recreation and tourism and other, areas. So there is that human benefit, and there's those, tangible aspects of conservation that, people can latch on to and really connect it to, their everyday lives and in their communities. So that's been my goal. And I've been able to do that without, a vast understanding and a vast knowledge of, the science behind the work. But like I said, don't get me wrong, I still definitely need to understand the science behind the work, but it wasn't necessary for me to start in this field. And I think that's very important. And I think as more people come to understand this, that you don't necessarily need to have that science background to make an impact in conservation. And especially with the continuation of projects like programs like the fellowship that I'm in and others that kind of expand the opportunity to gain experience in this field to other disciplines that aren't, traditionally associated with conservation. I think the more people will understand what I've come to understand, that, I don't need a PhD to make an impact here. And so, and I think that will only go to support diversity of people and a diversity of ideas to enter this space, which is always a good thing. And it always serves to positively impact the work that's already being done. I think the more people that we can get, engaged with this field, whether professionally or, just through volunteering or maybe just donating to the cause, the greater the impact that, TNC and other organizations will be able to make as far as conserving the environment. So those are my thoughts. And now I will turn it over to Lisa to close this out.
Ms. Taylor, that was great. We are so proud of her and glad she's on our team. You know, and I think everybody, that was such a great job from the Louisiana crew. It's just a taste of the conservation work we're doing across the state. And following on what Michael said, you know, we can't wait for you to come visit us in person. I think to sit together, to eat crawfish and to experience the place directly. And as a further enticement, Brian is going to lead everybody on a tour of the Atchafalaya Conservation Center, which you see in the background. So just as we finish the Q&A, whoever can stay on for just, you know, a few minutes, we'll take you out to the conservation center. So I'm Lisa Kreisman. I didn't finish that up, but I'm the interim state director right now. And I'd like to thank everybody for participating in today's webinar. It's, you know, important work that we're doing here. And I wanted to share a little bit of contact information in case you wanted to follow up with us. On this slide, you see at the top our website that you can go to learn more about some of our programs. And if you would like to connect with us directly to talk some more about this work or to support through a donation, the important work you've learned about today, you can either use our mailing address there or contact us via email, and that's lafo@tnc.org. And we'll follow up with you right away. So we appreciate your interest and look forward to a continued relationship with you. So we're going to switch over now to the question and answer series. And if we don't get to your question today, in the live, you know, show here, we're going to follow up with you via email. So we will be in touch. So let me go to our questions. One of the things that I think is very timely is, Seth, what birds are we hearing? You mentioned Parula, but is there anything else you could identify for us?
Sure. So we're hearing, there's all kinds of stuff. But since we've been sitting here talking today, there's been a northern Parula warbler that's been going from this cypress, the cypress behind you, and they actually nest in moss. They make their nest in Spanish moss, and there's one going back and forth up, and it's been a real distraction. But I've been watching it work on its nest, and like I said, so that's a northern Parula. They're Pathonotary warblers, which are just bright yellow little warblers. We were listening to a chickadee earlier. There's some. We had a woodpecker on the willow behind us too. Earlier, and then there was a kingfisher that dropped out and caught a crawfish and flew across the bayou with it earlier. There were some brown-headed cowbirds out here. I mentioned the hawks that were getting ready to start a family, and we had a bald eagle earlier. So we have all kinds of stuff here. We're really ramping up towards the peak of migration in the middle of next month. It's a great time to be in southern Louisiana.
Yeah, and I guess that's a very important role of the basin itself is for migration. So Brian, switching over to you, you mentioned the importance of working within the community in the Atchafalaya, and how, you know, have you and others on staff worked with the people who live there, you know, those that may be somewhat suspect of who the Nature Conservancy is and how we work?
Yes, yeah, no problem. That's a great question. So a number of ways. First of all, the Conservation Center was all custom built. I'm going to go into this a little bit, but all the barges that they sit on were custom made about 4 miles south of here. The buildings on top were built by an 86-year-old man whose camp is right there. He passed away actually while just before he finished. And his wife still comes out to the camp, and she comes and visits us a lot. We do a lot of public meetings. Whenever we're going to do something out here, we engage with the community. We have you know, members of our staff who reach out to certain people people call us, and a lot of times when we're out here, and I'm actually surprised that it hasn't happened yet today, we'll have fishermen, the crawfishermen, before they come in to bring their crawfish in, they'll stop if they see us out here and just talk to us and see how everything's going. So we're engaged with the community in a number of ways. The Conservation Center is all about doing this here. It takes us away from being an organization in Baton Rouge to having a place out here on the land, and having this land and being a landowner and a stakeholder as well as a conservation organization really is helpful and really helps us with the community. And so far we've been accepted very well in the community, and we continue to work on that all the time.
Great, thank you. That's something to be very proud of. So Taylor, here's a question for you. How can we get more people, more young people involved in conservation, both, you know, as a career or just as something that they enjoy and appreciate and feel compelled to help work to protect in the future?
Like I said, I think more opportunities in this space, like the fellowship, and just partnering with different, you know, organizations, kind of meeting them where they're at, and not expecting them to come to you, and just showing them all the benefits and all the beauty of, you know, conservation is one way to do it. I found that it's hard to get students and young people to engage with you on their own. So I think it's partially just meeting them where they're at, and just providing them the opportunity to learn. Like I said, this space particularly is something that's hard for people to grasp, and kind of like they may be a little wary to enter the space. So I think just kind of eliminating those barriers and coming to them and just, you know, expressing why you love what you do, and also just sharing with them the benefits to, you know, the community, but also, you know, coming out here, I've just learned a lot about birds just on and off screen. And you can tell that, you know, Seth and Brian and Karen, like they're all passionate about what they do. And I think seeing that up close and personal is one way to do that. And so if that's just, you know, more fellowships, or just, you know, partnering with, a Louisiana LSU organization, student organization that has nothing to do with conservation or science, and just, you know, bringing them out here or whatever the case may be. I think that's a great way to start and kind of build from the ground up.
Great, thank you. I think that's such a great point, that we need to be more proactive and purposeful about being open and available, certainly connecting people with our properties, important. And so we definitely need to work some more on that. So the next question I have is for both Karen and Seth. It's about the BP oil spill. So part of the question is, what are the lasting impacts of the spill to the biology, ecology of the coast? So, you know, maybe that's for you, Seth. And then Karen, what's been happening since the spill from a restoration perspective in the state?
So I'll take that first part. I think the jury is actually still out on what exactly is happening. I mean, clearly there was a lot of obvious damage that everyone saw on the news, and sometimes it was very widespread, sometimes it was very localized when oil would come ashore. If you're out there today just looking at it, you wouldn't know that we had this monumental spill over 10 years ago. That said, they're going to be, you know, I think chemicals and sediments for decades to come. And again, there's a lot of science going on, and there's a lot of the funds from the spill is paying for a lot of science, especially around health and safety. I can tell you that one of the first things when the spill happened, I was actually still living and working in Florida, and everyone was, you know, worked in Apalachicola, so people were worried about getting seafood out, and so that was like the most rigorously tested thing. Once they had it capped and we knew where it was, is the you know, money went into, you know, paying people to thoroughly test things and things like that, so we could actually get seafood back out, be confidently get seafood back out to consumers. and get people back on their feet and made a living on seafood. And so, and there's still a lot of testing for that. You know, we still see a lot of dolphin populations. I look at landings data a lot for things like oysters, big surprise, but it's actually in Louisiana, our landings have actually gone up since the spill. We had the year right after it was bad. And then since then, it's more or less increased a little bit. Other states, not so much, but it had a little bit to do with the spill, but more to do with other factors. And so, you know, there may be some legacy issues that we will learn about later. But overall, I think that a lot of the mitigation efforts that have been taken and a lot of the science that's being done is definitely helping us at least think about, you know, human health and safety and the restoration recovery of habitats. And so far, that looks like it's going reasonably well.
So from the restoration project perspective, I mentioned that we have a coastal master plan for a sustainable coast. And unfortunately, Louisiana's crisis led us to be prepared for some opportunities, which we wouldn't have asked for again, associated with spill funding. The oil spill penalty money flows through, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details because there are a lot of details, but basically there is the Restore Act, which funds different things related to restoration, a Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund, through which penalties through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and natural resources damages. What we've basically done in Louisiana is take this opportunity to not only do the science that Seth is talking about through different teams, but also to choose restoration projects that will help make the coast more resilient. For example, the spill hit the hardest probably in the Barataria Basin, which was already experiencing incredibly high rates of land loss. And again, all of the things that go with that coastal ecosystem, the habitats, the risk to communities, and so forth. So in some cases, two different streams of that money are flowing into one big, like that's a $1.2 billion project as an example. So in short, the investment is being made in the implementation of coastal projects that are being refined, but we're on the books for being done already. And again, these are range from things like oyster reefs to very large landscape level diversions and marsh creation projects that should work together to replace the estuarine functions and make the coast more resilient.
Great. Thank you, Karen. I mean, I think for those of you that can make it down here next year or even talk further with the staff, you know, coastal restoration, it is a big bear and it's an important thing, and but very challenging, very complicated. So Brian, here's a question for you. How does the freshwater and silt flow affect seagrass beds in estuaries and in the Gulf?
Another good question. So one thing that's important is that the sediment and the silts that are coming down here down through the Mississippi River is why we have such a rich coastal system and rich river system, our biodiversity here, and those sediments and silts come out of the river, and when we can get them into the wetlands in our coast to build the wetlands, they're very good for building wetlands. Now, where you generally find our seagrass beds are in areas where either that silt and sediment has been filtered out and either has been added to marshes, or it's areas where the major flows of the currents don't hit. And so you find them in calm waters. You also find them out. You find these big seagrass beds in these kind of areas that are where they're not getting just a ton of sand and heavy sediments. So the coast tells a story. It tells a geological and an ecological story by when you're looking at it. And the seagrass is one character in that story, and you expect to find that character in a certain place, and it's because of how everything else is functioning. So the converse of that is that the rich nutrients and silts and sediments that are coming in the water really provide a great environment for the growth of those species. And so all of this is tied together. And so something is neither good nor is bad. They're all just characters in one big story.
Great. Thank you, Brian. So here's a more general question for anything you'd like to share from the panel. How is climate change influencing our conservation work in Louisiana? And what are we doing about it? So Seth, I don't know if you want to start at the coast.
No, I can. So we actually did a virtual field trip several months ago that talked about climate, and we'll have to follow up with you all with that link. We still have it. On the coast, I didn't mention this during the presentation, but for instance, the oyster reefs, we're in a period of sea level rise. We're also on a platform that's sinking due to subsidence, which is natural. The oyster reefs, if you site them correctly in the right salinity regime, they'll grow and thrive and maintain themselves, and they can actually increase their height incrementally, to a point. And so that's really good. In terms of, increasing that resilience that we talked about earlier and reducing risk to the adjacent shorelines. That's one way that our actual on the ground work it also has climate benefits. It's no panacea for sure, but it's a way that we can address it. And I think some of these, larger projects that Karen mentioned too on the coast in terms of getting sediment, working with our partners in the federal and state government to make sure that flows of water and sediment get to it. That's actually part of it. Those are processes that maintain habitats. And when we restore and allow those processes to work like they had traditionally worked, then they definitely, combat some of the effects we're feeling from climate, as well as slow a lot of the change down that we're seeing. Again, the coast is an ephemeral coastline. It will always change. It's to the rate at which it changes that's troubling, and one of the things that the state and a lot of our partners and us are trying to combat. So that's just a couple examples.
Yeah, in these river systems, we're actually seeing what we think is a pronounced climate change signal. When I started working in this basin, for example, it was probably about 26 years ago. We used to have the water would come up in the spring and go back down. Sometimes we'd get 2, very rarely 3 high flow pulses in a spring. It would start coming up anywhere from January, February out to maybe late May. Sometimes we'd get one pronounced pulse event. Now what we're seeing, and we've been seeing this year after year after year, is that the river is coming up in its kind of normal way with the snow melts. But those snow melts are happening earlier, so we're getting higher water earlier. And what we're also seeing is that once this river's coming up, it is just staying up. And so we're receiving about 30% of the Mississippi's flow. So whatever the Mississippi's doing, we're doing. And because we receive so much water, when we get these huge 10, 12, 15-inch rain events across the Tennessee Valley, across the Arkansas Valley, when you see massive flooding happening in these river basins to the north of us, we're going to get that water. And so we're seeing the river come up, and then we think it's going to go back down, and we see these huge rain events come across the Ohio, the Arkansas, the Missouri, wherever it is, and then the river blips up again and it stays there. And then it happens over and over and over. And we're getting, over, 6 months of these pulse events, years after year after year. And if we don't reestablish the drainage out of these swamps, we're going to just drown them. They can take long flooding. They can't regenerate when they're underwater for months and months and months at a time. And so that's why this restoration work is so important, and we're learning, and that's why our monitoring work, our scientific monitoring, is critical, because we're learning as we're going, because this entire Mississippi basin is changing, we think, and we have to change along with it. So I'll turn it over to Karen. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add very quickly from a policy perspective, we've been appointed to Governor Edwards' Climate Initiatives Task Force, and we're taking that opportunity to both say, are there opportunities for emissions reductions, the net goal being zero net emissions by 2050 with increments, and also how can we help sequester carbon dioxide, forestry projects, reforestation, afforestation. We're thinking about how is habitat going to migrate. That is Seth and Brian talked about the impact to our natural systems. How will the freshwater supply, will we have droughts that are impacted in the future by climate change? So we're really trying to work by bringing our science to the policy lens to help think about how we're going to address climate change in Louisiana.
Great, thank you. So we have just a couple of minutes, but here was a great question, and we'll start with Taylor and go to each of you to very briefly say, what is your favorite project that you've been involved with or appreciate in the Louisiana program? So I don't know if you're involved long enough to do that, but you'll have to come up with something, maybe the Atchafalaya, I don't know.
Yeah, so I'm definitely still learning about all of the projects happening, but obviously this is a great one. I'm definitely in awe with what I see around me, and this is only my third time coming out here in the span of a couple of days. So I haven't really gotten the chance to see all of the work that's being done just due to, COVID. But I can say this, if all of the projects are like this, if all of, the sites look like this, I don't know how anybody could come here and not, want to be a part of it. So this is definitely obviously the work is great, but the space is beautiful as well. So by far, this is my favorite. It's also the only one I've seen so far, but it's great, believe me.
Great, thank you. Next.
So I will say that I'm excited about the implementation of a lot of coastal projects. I love this place. I also love Mollisey Farms because it's an example of so much of what we do, restoration of habitat, water quality benefits, and it also helped the city of West Monroe maintain their levee certification because it provided a bigger floodplain. So that was really important to that community. So that in addition, we just remarked at how important nature is, a healthy system is to our human community.
Great, thanks.
So I have two. Obviously, the Atchafalaya River Basin, this is very important to me. This basin is one of my oldest friends in Louisiana. I drove my Ford Ranger with no air conditioning from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, straight down here. They put me in a boat and took me out to where the Atchafalaya meets the Gulf, gave me a boat and said, "Don't die." And that's when I started working in this system. And some of my best friends, some of my best memories and people I still work with today. And look, we get to build a conservation station and work out here. So this is one of my favorites. My second favorite is the work that we've done around oysters, because there's a lot behind it, but we really worked with getting the monitoring and research going on these reefs so that, and really set an example that the state of Louisiana picked up, where nobody talked about reefs as a potential for coastal restoration. We really built that into their minds, and now living shorelines are a part of the coastal master plan, and that's because of the great work that Seth and his team is doing. And I got to work with Seth for years, and that was awesome.
So Seth, you'll have to say it very short since we're running.
I will. But picking a favorite project is like picking a favorite child. But I will say that what really nurtures me and invigorates me is this oyster resource group I mentioned earlier, just because, I love the on-the-ground work. That's really what I want to do, is the on-the-ground work, getting things out of the ground. But working with a group of people who come from diverse backgrounds and have different ways of relating to the resource, but are coming together around it to try to find, again, shared solutions. I love that. It makes me happy every time I go to this meeting with them. So I'll pick that one.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. This has been fabulous. For those of you that, as I mentioned earlier, that can stay with us for about 10 more minutes, we're going to have a tour of the Atchafalaya Conservation Center. Brian will take us through real quick, and you could see on screen what you'll be able to see in person, hopefully in the future. And as they go over and get set up for that, I did want to acknowledge we're working with some other partners within TNC, colleagues in TNC, the Discover with Nature program. And they'll have information if you connect through this website here about the future trip down to Louisiana or other trips where TNC is working, and they just do a phenomenal job. And I also wanted to quickly address, while they're getting set up, for those that are still on the call, that there were a few questions about our work with youth, doing environmental education. And we do have a number of preserves across the state where we do programs, or we have it open for the people to come on their own any time of day. At Grand Isle down at the coast, our staff there actually works with students to in the classroom to collect acorn seeds, grow the acorns, and plant for the maritime forest that has been impacted. Out at the Atchafalaya Conservation Center, where we've just had that open for a short time, so we're trying to get our feet under us, but definitely see the need and the opportunity to work with youth out there in the future. So thanks for all those questions. And now I'm going to turn it over to Brian to start the tour of the center.
Hey, welcome aboard. Before we go into the Conservation Center, I just want to tell you a little bit about it. This is two 60-foot barges. They're custom made. This whole thing is floating. If you look, you'll see these big long pipes. These are called spuds. There's another one on the other side of the barge, and when the Atchafalaya River comes up, our barge goes up, and when it goes down, our barge goes down. So this thing will fluctuate probably about 6 to 8 feet from low to high here. We call this one the meeting barge, and I'm going to show you in a second, but this is where we have groups, our big groups we can house. This one is our sleeping barge. This is a quarters barge. So this is where most of our bedrooms are. And we are in the swamp, but we are a fully functioning office and research station. We have all the creature comforts of home. We have power, internet, and water. We can access, we're lucky here, we can access from the shore by vehicle, or we can access by boat. So come aboard. So welcome. You can see we have open meeting space. This is where we like to get people together to talk about conservation. You can see the beautiful woodwork. I talked about Mr. Ori, who was built the camp. He was a master carpenter, and so he put a lot of pride. He loved this project, and he really helped us out and put a lot into this place. Also, speaking of master woodwork, our state director just retired. Today is his first day of retirement, but he not only left us with conservation, but he left us with a big table that he built to talk about conservation. So coming out here, this is my absolute favorite place on the Conservation Center. This is Bayou Tensaw that you see in front of you, and this is Bayou Sorrel flowing into Bayou Tensaw. You're looking south. All the land in between these two bayous is where the Atchafalaya Basin Preserve is. So we're very close to our preserve, and this is where we like to have people talk about conservation, because how can you say no when this is where you're sitting and talking? You can see you can't get much more in the swamp to talk about swamp conservation than where we are now. You can see the water is very high right now. You can see we have a lot of current. The Atchafalaya River is high, so we're receiving its waters through here. And so this out here is a river in some places. We're seeing a lot of barn swallows that have just made their way back. And we saw some bald eagles and things this morning. Right here is where all our boats pull up. Usually there's boats here. We access this by, like I said, both land and by water. And many of our visitors and friends who come and partners come up, they don't come up by vehicle. They all come up by boat. So usually this has a number of boats parked here. So now we're going to go into the sleeping barge, and this is where we house our guests, our students, our visiting scientists, or us when we're working for multiple days down in the swamp. So you can see in here, we have a full kitchen. We have 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms in here, as well as a pull-out futon. And with all of our space out here, we can house up to about 12 people, depending on the configuration. And finally, we're out to another screened-in porch. This porch is where our guests enjoy a nice, quiet cup of coffee in the morning, or a nice, maybe a beverage at night at the end of the night. It's a really relaxing place. There's not as much boat traffic. It's very quiet on this end. So we offer people this ability to get away and just be quiet and experience the sounds of the swamp. So I'd like to thank you. That's our tour. I'd like to really thank you for joining us for this trip and for this tour. And please, if you come on one of our in person on one of our trips, you will get to experience the Conservation Center yourself. We would love to see you. Thank you, and thank you for your time today.